let's go ahead and get started this evening. We'll go to Acts chapter 24. Acts chapter 24. Today we'll begin reading at verse 1, and we'll just go down to verse 9 for our text this evening. It says, "And after 5 days, Ananias the high priest descended with the elders, and with a certain orator named Tertullus, who informed the governor against Paul. When he was called forth, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, Seeing that by thee we enjoy great quietness, and that very worthy deeds are done unto this nation by thy providence, we accept it always, and in all places, most noble Felix, with all thankfulness. Notwithstanding, that I be not further tedious unto thee, I pray thee that thou wouldest hear us of thy clemency a few words. For we have found this man a pestilent fellow, and a mover of sedition among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, who also hath gone about to profane the temple, whom we took and would have judged according to our law. But the chief captain Lysias came upon us, and with great violence took him away out of our hands, commanding his accusers to come unto thee by examining, of whom thyself mayest take knowledge of all these things whereof we accuse him. And the Jews assented, saying that these things were so." So this is the beginning of chapter 24. Paul before Felix, and we find false accusations from the Jews. And that's what I've entitled this, False Accusations from the Jews. As promised, Paul was held waiting for his accusers, and they showed up, didn't they? Ananias came with an orator. Perhaps you might think of him as an attorney, a lawyer, named Tertullus. Now, Tertullus may have been a Gentile, or he may have been a Jew, we don't know. But it wasn't uncommon in those days for the Jews to hire pagan lawyers who were more familiar with the Roman law than they were. We shouldn't think anything odd of that. We hire pagan lawyers, pagan plumbers, pagan pizza delivery people, whatever, all the time. Really, if you think about it, you could say, well, I'd rather a Christian work on my electricity. And you come to church here and you say, David, you're a Christian, come work on my electricity. I can guarantee you, neither one of us would want me to work on your electricity. However, there's some experts out there who know what they're doing. And some of those guys may not be Christians. We think nothing of that, and we shouldn't, because they're experts in their field. And so we go and we hire them to do a job, and as the Lord allows, we may even have opportunity to witness to those folks as we do it, or as they do it, as it were. Tertullus, though, there's a big question mark as to who he was, whether Jew or Gentile. His name could go either way, and in the text, here, sometimes he identifies himself with the Jews by the use of the word we. In verse 3, for instance, he says, "We accept it always, and in all places, most noble Felix." Verse 4, "Notwithstanding that I be not further tedious unto thee, I pray thee that thou wouldest hear us of thy clemency." A few words. Verse 6, "Who also had gone about to profane the temple, whom we took." So those verses you say, well, he must have been a Jew. But then in verse 9, it seems to differentiate him from the rest of them, because it says the Jews also assented, saying that these things were so. So, big question mark there about Tertullus. But kind of an interesting fellow here. The trial is happening in Caesarea. It had taken the Jews about 5 days to gather up their people, get everything in order, get Tertullus, and come on down. 5 days after Paul had already arrived. Remember, he had come with pretty much an army, and then all of those things happened, and so on and so forth. Along with Ananias and his orator, there were some elders. We see that there in verse 1. These were probably members of the Sanhedrin. And my guess is this may have been why they were delayed a bit getting to where he was. Possibly because, remember, the Sanhedrin council was made up of Pharisees and Sadducees, and Paul had divided them up into an argument, just with the words of, in Acts 23 and verse 6, when Paul said, "Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, of the hope and resurrection of the dead, I am called in question." That caused a split between them, an argument, and all of that, a lot of confusion. It's all because the Sadducees deny the resurrection. And where they had been united against Paul, they were now arguing and all of that sort of thing. So probably took them a little bit to kind of sort that out, maybe calm down a little bit, whatever. But verses 2 through 4 here, when he was called forth, Tertullus began to accuse him. Saying, "Seeing that by thee we enjoy great quietness, and very worthy deeds are done unto this nation by thy providence. We accept it always, and in all places, most noble Felix, with all thankfulness, notwithstanding that I be not further tedious unto thee, I pray thee that thou wouldest hear us of thy clemency a few words." So he was called forth. This is the way that they started off the meeting, perhaps a crier to bring forth the defendant. And Tertullus begins with a flattering appeal to the governor. He says, "Seeing that by thee we've enjoyed great quietness, very worthy deeds are done unto this nation by thy providence. We accept it, and in all places, most noble Felix, with all thankfulness." Now, Felix was a governor of Judea from about AD 52 to AD 59. Felix actually was a former slave, and his brother, a favorite of Emperor Claudius, had obtained for him the position as governor. He was not highly regarded by the influential Romans of his day and accomplished little during his term as governor. He did defeat the Egyptian and his followers. We read about that in Acts 21 and verse 38. But his brutality angered the Jews and led to his ouster as governor by Emperor Nero 2 years after Paul's hearing. So, that's a little bit about Felix coming from John MacArthur. But after this show of flattery that he gives to Felix, Tertullus sets out to bring forth specific charges against Paul. Verses 5 through 7, we have found this man a pestilent fellow and a mover of sedition among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, who also hath gone about to profane the temple, whom we took and would have judged according to our law. But the chief captain Lysias came upon us, and with great violence took him away out of our hands. So he begins to set forth the specific charges against Paul. Number one, sedition. Sedition is a rising or commotion of less extent than an insurrection, less than rebellion, but some kinds of sedition in Great Britain amount to high treason, and here, of course, it was against Roman law. And connecting this to what he said earlier to Felix, Tertullus is implying that Felix has brought great peace upon the land, but Paul is a disturber of the peace with this sedition. And so that's number one. He's broken Roman law with sedition. Number two charge is sectarianism, meaning the disposition to dissent from the prominent religion and to form a new sect. That's why he's spoken of as being the ringleader of the Nazarene sect. Now this particular charge was against Jewish law. Of course, charge number one and charge number two are both false. He's not the ringleader of Christianity. He wasn't the main Pumbaa of the churches. He wasn't the Pope. There were no popes in the Lord's churches. But he was public enemy number one because he was out there on the front lines doing missionary work, taking the gospel to other places. Oftentimes, as you go back through history, you'll find the enemies of the gospel, the enemies of the churches of Christ, they would name a particular group of churches after some prominent leader among them. So, for instance, the Waldensians, they didn't choose that name, but they got that name because Peter Waldo among them. And so the Catholics and others, they said, well, they must be Waldensians. They're following Peter Waldo. And you can go on back from there, and you can trace other groups as well with similar stories. But he was also charged with sacrilege. That's the crime of violating or profaning sacred things, or the alienating to laymen or the common purposes what has been appropriated or consecrated to religious persons or use. So they said Paul violated the temple. This, said the Jews, was against God's law. Again, a false charge. But these three charges amounted to a charge against Roman law, against Jewish law, and against God's law. This is what they brought before this Roman court. Now, if you ever hear of theonomy, or many of the most extreme versions of Christian nationalism, this is what it would look like. Maybe not exactly like this, but very, very similar. And that is Christians being brought before human courts on account of improper interpretation of the Scriptures or even denominational traditions, depending on who's in charge. This has already been tried and failed among Christians. Europe was full of state churches. And even in this country, before the founding of the United States of America, and even in the early days, there was discussion on what would be the state church of America. The colonies had all had state churches, with the exception of Rhode Island. And all this goes back to Roman Catholicism. When Roman Catholics had, under Constantine, married church and state in unholy matrimony. And even though that was a terrible idea, the Protestants also, in a lot of ways, were no better. Some of them said they believed in separation of church and state, using terminology like what we're familiar with, but it looked something like, this. The state church would find the heretics, and heretics is a very fluid term, depending on, again, who's in charge. But the state church would find the heretics, point out the heretics, and the state government then would take those heretics and kill the heretics. And so they would say, well, it's separation of church and state. See, the church is just calling them out and the state is killing them. Well, sadly, Baptists have always gotten the short, or rather the sharp end of the stick with those sorts of ideas. And even now, in our day, even though in America we're not facing threats of death or persecution from our government, there is persecution going on in other places all over the world, and there are threats and even death, killings being carried out by governments. And where are the worst places? Well, they are Muslim countries where Islam is the state-sponsored religion, and communist countries where the state is the sponsored religion. And so those two places, those two types are the worst, and that's where the worst persecution happens. I am very much opposed to theonomy. The reality is that this has come about through post-millennial teachings. The reality is that Christ is going to come back someday, and He's going to clean all this mess up, and He will sit on the throne of David. We have never been told to go about and try to clean up governments, but we are told to take the gospel into all the world. We're never told to be revolutionaries. We're never told to overthrow governments. But we are told to take the gospel into all the world. And that's what we should be doing. That should be our focus. The Great Commission. Well, in verse 8 there of Acts 24, it says, commanding his accusers to come unto thee, by examining whom thyself mayest take knowledge of all these things whereof we accuse him. This is the end of Tertullus's accusation. Now in your King James Version, it's kind of hard to tell that. I don't know if quotation marks were non-existent in the 1600s and early 1700s, or if they were optional. But that's why when you're studying and reading, it's always helpful to also look at this in a commentary and even look in some of the newer versions and see the punctuation that is missing. It is helpful. I wish I would have picked up on this in school. My teachers, including my mom, would scold me for not using proper punctuation. I could have pointed out that the translators of the King James Version were very, very brilliant men, and they didn't use punctuation on their translation. But somehow, I don't think that Mom would have thought it was funny. But I digress. That is something to consider when you're reading, and is helpful to look at. So, verse 9, the Jews also assented, saying that these things were so. So the Jews that were there, they joined in and they said, oh yes, this is true. That was their way of saying amen. This is it, go get him. And this is how it was for Paul. They just kept piling it on, it seems. One attack after another, one false accusation after another. But I'm reminded of what Jesus had said in Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5, verses 10 through 12. He says, blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are ye when men shall revile you, and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely, for my sake. Rejoice, and be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so persecuted they the prophets which were before you. This is what Jesus told his followers. You're blessed if you're persecuted for righteousness' sake. Yours is the kingdom of heaven. You're blessed when men will revile you, when they persecute you, when they say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. He said to rejoice and to be exceeding glad. Great is your reward in heaven. So persecuted they the prophets which were before you. Lord willing, next week we'll look at Paul's response, but understand, beloved, that what Jesus said here is what he told his followers. And even though Jesus had already ascended and gone back up into heaven, by the time Paul was saved and even now as we study in Acts chapter 24, as he's persecuted, going through all these troubles, this applied to Paul, and it applies to us too. Underline it, remember it, and be glad when persecution does come. When people say things against you falsely for my sake. Great is your reward in heaven. That's a promise from our Lord. May God add a blessing to the preaching of his word this evening.